Welcome to the fourth edition of Chemistry in Agriculture. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to talk a little bit about ions and precipitation. Dr. Jim Schaefer as well as Dr. Wenu will be giving some presentations on this topic. So I'm going to go ahead and let Dr. Wenu start us off.
So now we are going to start Chemistry in Agriculture. Our topic is going to be ions and precipitation reaction. So we have two parts. Part one is ions. We will cover cations, anions, B, plant and food minerals, C, soil cations, exchange capacity, plant absorption of soil minerals. Part one. Anion is an important. An ion is an atom or a molecule with an electrical charge resulting from gain or loose electrons. When an electron is lost, a positive charge results. When an electron gains electrons, a negative charge results. Two ions with opposite charge attract each other. When the attraction holds the ions together, it is called an ionic bond. Sol is a synonym for an ionic compound. So if we take a look here, water also can ionize itself. So when it's ionized, it becomes hydroxyl and proton. Proton is H+. So basically, water can accept or donate protons. Part B, cations and anions. When a neutral atom loses an electron, we call it becomes cation. And when a neutral atom gains an electrons, it becomes anion. So just briefly, we want to compare the cations versus anion. Cation basically positively charged, and it has more protons than electrons. If we see this diagram briefly, this atom has 5 protons and 3 electrons. It means more extra 2 protons here, so it's become 2+ ion. As opposed to anion here, it's negatively charged. It's more electron than protons. So in this diagram, or in this picture, we see 3 protons and 5 electrons. So we summarize briefly cations versus anion. Cations, the positively charged ions. Anions, the negatively charged ions. Cations, the least electronegative or most electropositive ion. Anions, the most electronegative ions. So again, cations include metals, and they are often located on the left side of the periodic table. Anions include halogens and nonmetals. They are located on the right side of the periodic table. Some of the examples of cations are sodium ion, potassium ion, K+, calcium ion, Ca2+, silver ion, and iron have 2 forms, iron 2 and iron 3. So examples of anions: fluoride, chloride, hydroxide ion, oxide anion, sulfate anion. Here are some ionic compounds formula. We have lithium fluoride, and it produces Li+ cation and F of fluoride anion. So very famous one, we have examples here, sodium chloride, sodium ion, and chloride ion. So another examples I'll take here, calcium chloride. In the solution, it will give calcium ion and chlorine ion, and so forth. If we take a look in the periodic table, so the cation is located in the left side of the periodic table. In the very left, go to the 1 plus ion, and the second part have 2 plus and 3 plus, and so forth. And in the right side of the periodic table, we have the anion. We can start here from nitrogen. It's 3 minus, oxygen 2 minus, and fluoride, chloride in this column is 1 minus, except for the noble gases. They are stable, so they don't create ions. So B, plant food minerals. Here are some minerals elements that are essential for plants. So we have seen this one before, but just briefly we can repeat that. So elements nitrogen is the chemical symbol is N, and then the chemical forms absorbed by crops is nitrate, and ammonium is negative ion, nitrate, and ammonium is the positive ion or cations. So potassium is cation, K plus. Phosphorus is have 3 forms here. It's hydrophosphorus and biphosphorus and phosphate ion. They are all negatively charged. Secondary nutrients, calcium, Ca2 plus, magnesium, Mg2 plus, and sulfur. Sulfur make in sulfate ion. And moreover, we see the micronutrient in the form of their ions. Boron is BO3 minus, and chlorine is Cl minus, and so forth. So now I think we play one video here just to get the idea.
Essential mineral elements. Most of the minerals present in the soil can enter plants through roots. Analysis of ashes of different plants reveal the presence of about 60 elements. All the 60 elements are not present in all plants. Only 16 elements are present in all plants. These elements are necessary for plants. Some elements are essential for certain plants only. Example, sodium is essential only for C4 plants and halophytes. Silicon is essential only for grasses, and cobalt is essential for blue-green algae. Daniel Arnon and Perry Stout carried out experiments on the essentiality of nutrients in tomato plants. They laid down basic requirements to determine the essentiality of an element. These basic requirements are called Arnon's criteria of essentiality. Arnon's criteria for essentiality. The element must be necessary for supporting normal growth and reproduction. In the absence of the element, the plants do not complete their life cycle or set the seeds. The requirements of the element must be specific and not replaceable by another element. In other words, deficiency of any one element cannot be met by supplying some other element. The element must be directly involved in the metabolism of the plant. Classification of mineral elements. Elements are divided into essential elements and non-essential elements. Essential elements are again divided into macronutrients and micronutrients. Essential elements. Based upon the Annan's criteria for essentiality, 16 elements are found to be essential for plant growth and metabolism. Such elements are called essential elements. These elements are further divided into two categories based on their quantitative requirements. 1. Macronutrients, and 2. Micronutrients. Some plants require some additional elements for their growth and reproduction. These elements are called non-essential elements. Example: sodium, silicon, aluminium, cobalt, selenium, strontium, vanadium. List of macronutrients. These are 9 elements and generally present in plant tissues in large amounts. Macronutrients include 1. Carbon, 2. Hydrogen, 3. Oxygen. These 3 elements are obtained from CO2 and H2O. 4. Nitrogen. 5. Phosphorus. 6. Sulfur. 7. Potassium. 8. Calcium. And 9. Magnesium. These are absorbed from soil as mineral nutrition. List of micronutrients. These are 8 elements needed in very small amounts. Hence, they are also called trace elements. They include 1. Iron, 2. Manganese, 3. Copper, 4. Molybdenum, 5. Zinc, 6. Boron, 7. Chlorine, 8. Nickel.
Happy to join all of you again today and talk about ions. These ions are actually, as you can see from the presentation of Dr. Wenu and the video clip that he has just shown, ions are a central component of any agricultural system, especially, mostly we're talking crops and animals, but ions are utilized in the metabolic system, in the physiology of plants. I'm going to share my screen now. Farmers manage ions. This is actually the heart of what we know in agriculture as the fertilizer business. Okay, so from a commercial point of view, the business of ions, the utilization of ions, the delivery of ions into a production system, whether it be animals or plants, is called plant nutrition or animal nutrition. And understanding what ions are and acknowledging that farmers actively manage ions is understanding an application of chemistry in agriculture. We now will shift our attention to a few points about the presence of ions in the soil, the management of ions in the soil, and the interrelationship between plants and ions in the soil. We're going to follow the pathway of ions as they occur in soils through and into plant physiology, and closely associated to that, the morphology of the plant. CEC. This stands for cation exchange capacity. By definition, it is the total capacity of a soil to hold exchangeable cations. It influences the soil's ability to hold onto essential nutrients and provides a buffer against soil acidification. Soils with a higher clay fraction tend to have a higher cation exchange capacity. Organic matter has a very high CEC. This is a micrograph of a soil clay particle, and the surface of clay particles are covered with negative charges. These negative charges on the surface of clay is an example of a soil particulate that hold, and the negative charges themselves are, from an electrochemical point of view, the definition and the basis for cation exchange capacity, because cations attach themselves to these negative charges in the soil. They attach themselves to these negative charges that occur on the surface of clay particulate. Okay, so now we're only talking about clay, but these negative charges are not limited to clay. Let's go to the next slide. This is beginning to introduce the concept of cation exchange, or CEC, within two types of soil profiles. On the right, we have a sandy loam. And in this case, we would probably be assuming as much as 70 or 80% sand. Sand can have a cation exchange that's quite poor, all the way down to zero. On the other hand, clay particulates in a soil profile, if clay is a high percentage of the texture of a soil, then the cation exchange is more likely in that soil profile to be much higher, up to 50 CEC. So there you see, from a soil textural point of view, a range of CEC related to the surface area of the soil particulate where the negative charges are occurring. And we want to give you a little perspective on what this looks like and why this is the case. This is a differentiation, a graphic differentiation between a clay particle, a silt particulate, and sand particulate in the soil. In this case, we're talking about the texture of the soil. The texture of the soil is made of sand, silt, and clay. And in soil science, we would comment that this is distinct from the structure in a soil. The structure of the soil is how sand, silt, and clay interact with each other and interact with organic materials, form structural components in the soil, which are called aggregates. Okay, so texture is not the same thing as aggregates. The cation exchange capacity, right at the moment, we're limiting the definition of cation exchange in a soil to the textural components. You can see the difference in size If you have a square meter of soil and you look at the amount of surface area on these soil particulates in that square meter of soil, and let's assume that you have a relatively evenly balanced soil between sand, silt, and clay, that textural component, which is contributing the largest surface area, is the clay. And looking at this visually, you can see why that's the case. If you have a barrel and you fill the barrel with sand, or let's change it, let's change the analogy. If you fill the barrel with tennis balls compared to filling the barrel with pellets from a gun, the pellets are much smaller than the tennis balls. When you measure the available surface area of the particulates in the barrel, you will find that the actual surface area is much greater with the pellets compared to the tennis balls. This is a very important measurement that contributes to the overall cation exchange capacity in a soil profile. Okay, so clay will tend to carry a higher cation exchange capacity in a soil profile, especially because the clay fraction has a much higher quantity of surface area compared to these other particulates in a soil profile. Here is a comparison. On the left, on the vertical axis, cation exchange capacity. On the horizontal axis, we have different components of an example in a soil profile. The first column is the soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is composed of molecules which collectively have a very large quantity of negative charges associated with the actual organic molecules. As a result, soil organic matter will have a very high cation exchange capacity. In this case, you see that it ranges from 200 to 400. Now, contrast the organic matter CEC to these components, these textural components in a soil. The first one, which is our second bar, is called a montmorillonite clay. That particular type of clay is very common to the central sections of the United States, and it is a type of clay that carries a very high cation exchange capacity, which is particularly relevant to the physics of that particular clay particulate. On the other hand, here is another common type of clay called kaolinite. As you can see, the cation exchange capacity for a kaolinite type of clay is only 25% of the montmorillonite because of the physics and the structural physics of the kaolinite particulate. There's simply more surface area on the montmorillonite. In the case of silt, another part of the texture of any soil will be silt. The cation exchange capacity for silt particulates is quite low, 2 to 5, and then sand can be 0 to 1. So sand on the beach will have a very low cation exchange capacity. On the other hand, if you have a soil that's filled with organic matter, 4%, 5%, 6% organic matter, dark soils normally, you tend to have a much higher cation exchange capacity. Also, soils that are very high in organic matter, and they also have, as a fraction of their soil profile, a high percentage of montmorillonite clays, which tend to be very dark. The combination of higher organic matter and montmorillonite clays produces the higher opportunity for cation exchange capacity, and the combination of those two components in a soil profile create some of the best soils we have on the planet. Where I'm located here in the state of Iowa in the United States, we have a very high percentage of this type of soil combination compared to other parts of the world. This is the central agricultural zone of the United States. Now, we're showing this slide in order to further elaborate on this point of what it means to a plant to be delivered mineral fertilizers on the right-hand side versus mineral fertilizers in combination with organic carbon or organic matter. So in agronomy, we might think of this as growing a green manure crop or a plow down cover crop. There are other ways of delivering organic matter into a soil profile at the same time that mineral fertilizers are delivered. So here you have a very simple illustration of organic matter being broken down by microorganisms and contributing to the plant foods that are available to the plant. The illustration is attempting to demonstrate that on the left-hand side, the plant response will be more profound if the plant soil complex includes a high percentage of organic matter, while at the same time delivering the required mineral fertilizers to support the physiological activity, or another way of saying that is to support the genetic potential of the plant. Another factor in managing cation exchange capacity is pH. As you can see on the left-hand side, at a very low pH, in this case 3.5, but also at 5.3, the cation exchange capacity at the surface of the soil particulates, you have a reduced capacity to hold on to these positively charged mineral components that are the plant foods that we wish to deliver ultimately to the plant through the root system. This pH at 7.0 creates the more optimum opportunity with regard to cation exchange capacity. pH will influence cation exchange capacity. Here's a look at what pH does with respect to the availability of these elements, these plant food components, in combination with the measurement of pH. As you can see in the upper part here, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, for the most part, above 6, up to 8, even 8.5 in some cases here. But in between 6 and 8, we have the greater availability of these elements. Now look at iron, manganese, boron, copper, and zinc. You'll see that they are mostly available when the pH is lower. Many times the delivery of these elements, especially the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, even magnesium, are delivered it directly into the soil complex. And then the management of the soil complex, pursuing in farm management or soil management, a pH range of 6.5 to 7.5 produces the greatest chance for the plant availability of these elements. So this is the management of pH relative to the availability of these particular plant foods. On the other hand, when you look at these elements, they are more likely to be managed in farm management by delivering them as foliar feeds. We deliver them directly to the leaf of the plant. They are imbibed through the stomata of the leaf. So you have a lot of these less essential elements, especially because they are more available at low pH. Instead of putting them into a soil environment, which is more neutral, it's often the best management practice for these elements is to deliver them directly to the leaf. Plant absorption of soil minerals. Plants absorb minerals as ions. In order to absorb any minerals from the soil, it should be dissolved in water. Plants absorb most of the minerals through the roots. They can also take mineral plant foods through their leaves. In roots, the mineral absorption usually takes place through the meristematic region of the root tip. This is the point of the root hair or the root tip where the cells are actively engaged in division for expansion of the root system. Passive mineral absorption. Passive mineral absorption is a passive process and does not require the expenditure of metabolic energy. This type of mineral absorption occurs along the concentration gradient by simple diffusion. Active mineral absorption. Active mineral absorption is an active process, and thus it requires the expenditure of metabolic energy, which is delivered by a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Active mineral absorption can occur both along and against the concentration gradient by osmosis or through special carrier proteins in the plasma membrane, which is found in the membrane of the plant hair root. Okay, in this graphic, we are showing the beginning of a process, which is an interrelationship between the root and the soil complex. In the case of number one, we say a clay particle which has negative charge ions, which are binding mineral cations. The protons are pumped down at number two. Protons are pumped from the roots, are freed from ionization of carbonic acid. The protons bind to the clay particles, which releases the cations into the soil. That represents an exchange of a hydrogen positively charged element is exchanged with a positively charged plant food, in this case, potassium. The potassium goes into the solution, which is the soil water. And as a soluble plant food, that ion is absorbed by the plant at the meris, right here, at the growing point of the root hair. How are root hairs adapted for absorption? They're long and provide a large surface area. And this is very important, they have a very thin cell wall. That is the membrane through which these salts, or ions, or in this case, a positive cation, makes its way across that membrane, either by passive absorption or active absorption. It's very interesting to look at the morphology of a root hair and how it actually forms. Okay, so this is a part of the cell wall of the taproot, and a specialized cell within the cell wall transforms itself into a root hair. This is the nucleus of the cell. This is the vacuole. In the vacuole, and you can see the entire morphology of that specialized cell in the cell wall forms and extends itself into the soil to make better contact with the soil particulate and the soil solution. Water and mineral ions are absorbed across this very thin cell wall of a root hair. Contrast the cell wall here in the root hair to the cell wall here. Okay. Now we're going to look at active and passive transport of the ions across that root hair membrane. Passive is a process of a concentrated solution here in the soil, moving to a less concentrated solution inside the plant liquid sap system. So if there are less ions that are in the solution, these are salts. If there are less of these salts in the solution inside the plant, then through passive transport, diffusion, more concentrated soil solution filled with these ions in solution, the ions will pass across that membrane and join the less concentrated area inside the plant. So this is called passive transport. Active transport is something a little different. And these are specialized, this engages specialized chemistries that are produced metabolically in the plant, which actually come from the photosynthetic system in the plant. ATP is an energy carrying molecule. One of the uses of ATP in the physiological functions of a plant relative to the absorption of ions from the soil solution is to fuel this plasma membrane with the energy to actually reach out, grab the ion, and force it into the sap of the plant. Okay? So this is often called a pump system. Energy is being used in this system, and the general label in this case is active transport of the ion across the membrane into the sap of the plant. This is another illustration. I like this illustration because it connects a lot of the different components, parts of this process. Well, first we have the root hair. We have soil particulates. We have this root hair extended from a cell in the cell wall of the taproot, the main root of the system. And these root hairs are making contact with the soil particulates and the water in the soil environment. As we've been discussing, there is a process of transport that takes place, either passive or active. Move these elements, the ionic salts that are in the water solution, to move them into the root hair, across the cortex of the cell of the root system, into the heart of the root, and ultimately to the delivery to xylem. And xylem is the morphological part of a plant where the plant foods that came from the soil are ultimately delivered to all parts of the plant through the vascular system that we call a xylem. And the xylem is uniquely involved in the upward movement and transport of water and the salts in solution. Transport of water and minerals in plants. Most plants secure the water and minerals they need from their roots. The path taken is soil, roots, stems, leaves. The minerals travel dissolved in the water, often accompanied by various organic molecules supplied by root cells. Physical forces drive the transport of materials in plants over a range of distances. Transport occurs on 3 scales. Within a cell, short distance, cell to cell, long distance in the xylem and the phloem of the plant. The xylem is upward, is the vascular part of the plant morphology, which is responsible for the upward movement, phloem for the downward movement. Transport occurs by 3 mechanisms: osmosis and diffusion, active transport, and bulk flow. Farmers manage ions. Farmers manage ionic mineral delivery. Farmers manage soil ionic holding capacity, cation exchange capacity. For example, farmers manage ion uptake by plants. Farmers manage ion transport inside of a plant. So we could say that farmers have a very close interconnected relationship with the process of plants taking up, utilizing ions that are delivered into the soil plant complex. Now we're going to switch to another topic, and I'm going to have Dr. Wenu come back now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and he can start, and he will present a few points, and then I will come back and present a few more points. Okay, Dr. Wenu.
Thank you, Dr. Jim. So we're going to continue with the part 2. Here we go. Let me choose this slide. Slowly. Part 2. Here we are in the part 2. 1 second. Yep, here we go. Let me share the slide. Yep. So this is part 2, precipitation reaction. So we're going to cover a few points here. Firstly, formation of soil from ions. Formation of a solid from ions. Second, soluble ionic compounds. Third, insoluble ionic compounds. And finally, you're going to see mixing liquid product in agriculture. The precipitation reaction is actually a very complex reaction. It defined as precipitation is a formation of a solid from two aqueous solutions. Example, the formation of silver chloride, argentum chloride, from silver nitrate and sodium chloride. So these two reactions, silver nitrate and sodium chloride, will form a white precipitation or white precipitate that actually goes to the bottom of the chamber or in the tube. And it also releases some colorless solution. So this is just a definition. We're going to look step by step. A formation of a solid from iron. This is an example reaction that results in the formation of an insoluble product are known as precipitation reaction. In this regard, we mix the potassium iodide with this PbNO3, and we got the product that precipitate in the bottom of this beaker glass. And we can see here, the product is in yellow in color. This is one example. So we're going to see more examples later. So basically, the precipitation reaction will perform insoluble particles in the bottom of this beaker glass or in the tube. So in this regard, so before it gets reacted, so the instant that the state solution are mixed, all four ions are present. It's potassium ion, iodine ion, nitric ion, and plumbum ion. When it gets mixed, then this plumbum iodine is going to sink. Let's see another example. We want to see how about the formation of calcium carbonate. So this is an insoluble ionic compound. When we use calcium carbonate as a carrier in the formulation, it generates a suspension in water. So basically, calcium carbonate is formed in high pH. So in a lower pH, where the precursor is coming from atmosphere, carbon dioxide mixed with water, it generates a bicarbonate in acidic pH. In the presence of calcium in alkaline pH or higher pH, so the bicarbonate react with calcium and generate calcium carbonate, which is insoluble. Soluble ionic compounds. So this is contrast with the first one that we defined. In aqueous solution, a salt of an ionic compound ionized to positive and negative ion. If the solvent is water, it will also ionize to give hydrogen and hydroxyl ions. The ion presents are therefore sodium, chloride, hydrogen, and hydroxyl. Ionic compounds dissolve in water. If the energy given off when the ions interact with water molecules components, for the energy needed to break the ionic bond in the solids and the energy required to separate the water molecule so that the ions can be inserted into solution. Some of the soluble ionic compounds we can see here, salt containing group 1 element, lithium, sodium, potassium, cesium, and rubidium are soluble. Salt containing nitrate ion are generally soluble. Salt containing chloride, bromide, or iodine are generally soluble. The very example of the soluble ionic compounds is sodium chloride or table salt. This is the most common ionic compound in soluble water. So this is how sodium chloride form. So the formation of soluble ionic compound in this regard, sodium chloride. When sodium atom repel an electron, it could become positively charged, and that electron actually accepted by the chlorine atom, so it becomes negatively charged. And the positively charged sodium combined with the negatively charged chloride, so we got sodium chloride. The first hand we got in the crystal form, but the crystal form can be easily broken in the presence of water. So they are very soluble ionic compound. So in contrast, let's see some examples of the solubility rules of ionic compounds in water. So water-soluble compounds. Compounds contain an alkali metal cation. Example, lithium, sodium, potassium, rubidium, cesium, and all of this ion is +1 ion. Or the ammonium ion, NH4+. And secondly, compounds containing the nitrate ion, NO3-, acetate ion, or chlorate ion, they are also very soluble ionic compounds. Compounds containing the chloride ion, bromide ion, or iodine ion, they are also very soluble. And finally, we see here, compounds containing the sulfide ions, also very soluble. There are some exceptions. Insoluble exception is a compound containing argentum, hydrargyrum, and plumbum. So they are insoluble. Compounds containing argentum, hydrargyrum 2+, plumbum, calcium, strontium, and barium. It's basically from the second column of this left side of the periodic table. So let's go back a little bit in very detail for insoluble ionic compounds. While some compounds dissolve almost completely, others dissolve to such a small extent that they are simply called insoluble compounds. When a compound does not dissolve in water, that means that the attraction between the ions in ionic compounds is greater than the one between ions and molecule of water. We have some examples here: calcium sulfate, silver chloride, and lead hydroxide. So we have seen some of these examples in the first part. So these some rules about the solubility. Solubility rules for ionic compounds in water, specifically insoluble ionic compounds. Water insoluble compounds. Compounds containing the carbonate, phosphate, chromate, or sulfate ions. Compounds containing hydroxy ion, also insoluble. A soluble exception, compounds containing lithium, sodium, gallium, rubidium, cesium, or ammonium. Also compounds containing lithium, sodium, potassium, rubidium, cesium, and barium. This is another way to look at that. So this is another chart that basically we have covered in the previous slides. So I can move that pretty to the next slide. So if we take a look some of this example, we can see in this video, it's quite a bit of quite a long video, but I can skip here some in this part.
We call this one a precipitation reaction. It's not to be confused with when you're talking about weather. When people do weather forecasting, they might describe, precipitation happening in the west. They're talking about rain too. So for example, these two bottles here, you can see they're completely transparent. They look very much like water. However, depending on which chemicals I mix together, we'll just get a completely different color. Or even if it's not colorful, it'll just be like a white cloud forming. And that's because we are basically mingling together some of the separated or dissolved particles of these two reactants, and some of those reactants may find each other very attractive, and so attractive they actually form solids. They'll have a really tight bond between the two, and they will separate out of the water. And then that'll usually have a bit of a trickle-down effect, so it'll eventually settle towards the bottom if you leave it still for a long enough amount of time. So I've got a few combinations here. I've tried to find some of the most pretty and the most beautiful. The sodium iodide compound here is quite transparent. You can see quite through it. It's just a little bit yellow. So now we're going to add our lead nitrate. And I'll just add a few drops. We can see that where the drops met at the surface, we have the precipitate forming, and hopefully on the camera you can start to see that it'll eventually start raining down and settling out. I just want to reiterate to you folks at home that the chemicals that we started off with were very transparent, and what we end up with is a chemical that is not very transparent at all. It's actually a solid. That's all. Hopefully it's starting to have these two chemicals. We've got copper sulfate versus sodium hydroxide. Now these are both very transparent liquids. Obviously this one here has a bit of color, so I just want to give you guys a better view of this, where you can see quite clear that it's a very transparent liquid. Just going to pour in as much as I can here. We've got a very dilute solution of copper sulfate. Normally it's a very intense, almost as blue as my glove when you have a higher concentration. And now I'm going to add the sodium hydroxide, which is very much transparent like water. And then I want you to have a look very closely at what happens. So now we can see that the solution is no longer transparent, so you can't see very clearly through it. We have a bit of a blue cloud, so it's very likely that our precipitate, the solid formation, is properly copper-based, because copper usually has this beautiful blue colour. And again, if we leave this for a bit of time, we'll start to see those particles, those little solid particles will eventually start to settle. But I think I might carry on to the next one here, so we can get a look at another one. Okay, this one here, our last demonstration, is going to be a combination between barium nitrate and sodium chloride. Hopefully there's enough solution here for it to work. Now, I've got a feeling this one here is probably going to be a white colour. So if that's the case, I'm just going to add the barium nitrate now, and you can see that's very much like water, completely transparent. However, just if in the occasion that it does perform a white precipitate, I've just got a bit of black cardboard here to provide a bit of contrast in the background. So hopefully you're able to pick that up on camera. So I'll just put that up nice and close. Might put it that way so we can get a bit of lighting. Okay, here we go with our second reagent, which is sodium chloride. Just going to add a few drops. Okay, so we can see that we don't have a chemical reaction between these two. So let's talk about that. Well, this is going to come down to solubility rules, where we notice that certain combinations of ions, so barium ions, nitrate ions, sodium ions, and chloride ions, there's actually a table you can look up and determine if you have certain combinations present. So, for example, I have barium and nitrate, and I look it up on the table, we see that that combination is soluble or has high solubility, hence why it's dissolved. Here, I could look up sodium and chloride and look at that combination on the table and find that it is also very soluble, hence why it's dissolved. If we look at some combinations, let's say mix the two, well, we could have a combination of barium and chloride, and we look that up, it's soluble. We could also look up another combination of sodium and nitrate that is also soluble here. So this is actually my mistake. I've actually chosen two chemicals that clearly wouldn't actually form any precipitates or any product that has low solubility. So I'm actually going to see if I can modify this slightly and find something that will pair really nicely with these two. So here's what I was referring to earlier about using a solubility table to determine whether the combinations, the possible combinations we get. Well, hope you've enjoyed this, everybody, and I will see you in the next video.
Okay, so now we are going to cover the concept of precipitation as it relates more concretely to the business of managing crops and animals in agriculture. There are many management responsibilities in agriculture that are related to the delivery of liquids. We will cover some of those here in our presentation. Precipitants. They are a common problem. Some chemistries do not mix well. Solids may form. Solids can block spray nozzles. Solids can block filtration in an injection system. Solids can block emitters in a drip irrigation system. Here's a filter. And as you can see, solids have formed. They've collected on the filter. And this type of collection will eventually shut down the filter. Here is a spray nozzle. Inside a spray nozzle, there are screens. Screens catch solids that have formed because of precipitation between different molecular components. Precipitants can form. The screen is designed to catch those precipitants so they do not clog up the orifice or the opening where the spray comes out of the spray nozzle. On the other hand, if the solid gets past the screen, then the solids or foreign matter, the unwanted material, may actually block the spray nozzle itself. There are many solutions that are used to keep these solids from blocking the liquid spray systems. This is an example of a product, spray tank cleaner. Most of these are, may be surfactant type technologies. Soap and water is one method for cleaning these systems. Anything that will break the solids, that will move them out of the system, is mandatory. Spray equipment must often, regularly be cleaned, especially whenever you switch from one type of chemistry to another type of chemistry, in order to avoid interactions from the residue of one chemistry with another new chemistry you wish to spray in your system. It's important to inject the exercise of cleaning the system to avoid precipitants in the spray system. This is a drip irrigation line. This is an emitter. As you can see, there are solids that have formed that may be a byproduct of the minerals in the water interacting with the chemistry that's being delivered through the drip lines. It might be fertilizers, it might be pesticides. And these solids are the precipitants. These precipitants interfere with the normal functioning of the emitter, the point where the drops are coming out of the drip line. One of the methods for cleaning a drip line is to open the end and flush the system. Here you can see they're flushing the system and the water is not clean. So powering up the irrigation system, opening the end of the line in the drip irrigation line, and flushing those lines is a regular maintenance process to manage precipitants in a drip irrigation system. We are delivering water through many different systems in farm management. Here you have atomized misters that are being used to keep these cattle inside this barn cooler. So this is to reduce the body temperature of the cows, and maintaining and managing the temperature of the cow is very critical for them to eat the maximum amount of food. If it's too hot, they will go off feed. So farmers will use misters inside the barns in order to keep the cattle more cool, so that the cattle are more relaxed, more comfortable, body temperature is more appropriate, they're not too hot, their appetite is stronger, and the quantity of milk that they produce, these are Ayrshire cattle, the quantity of milk they produce will be larger. Another misting system. A lot of greenhouses are watered with atomized mister systems. Managing the precipitants, solids that might interfere with the delivery of these mists is very critical. You would not want one section of your trays to not be watered adequately, because the uniform growth of your plants in the greenhouse will be lost. In summary, farmers manage delivery of liquids. Farmers must combat solid precipitants in liquid delivery systems. Farmers must clean delivery lines. Farmers must clean filters in the lines. Farmers must clean screens and nozzles. Farmers must monitor misting systems for solids blocking mist atomizers. So this is our presentation today. As normal, Kelly will be putting all of this on YouTube. It will be available to everybody to view at any point that you would like. Also, she will be sending our PowerPoint to everybody by email, so you'll have that resource as well. Thank you very much for attending today. Wishing everyone the best, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.